we will be presenting final briefings, and there are a bunch of things about this I hope you pay some attention to. Obviously, the content of the briefings, but I also want you to be thinking about this workshop as I've wanted you to think about it all semester, as a process. In other words, there are things that you did over the course of the past couple of months to learn about a new piece of legislation, about a new issue, the policy and scientific elements of that issue, and you have developed a fairly deep level of expertise over these couple of months about the issue you've been focusing on. This process, in a field as complex as ours, you will be replicating over and over again in your career. I started in water pollution, I went to toxic waste, I went to leaking underground storage tanks, I went to nuclear waste, eventually climate change, and a variety of other issues, all of which I knew nothing about when I started, and then I gradually became more expert in it. This is a process where you accelerate the development of that expertise. And so I want you to think about, how did I learn this stuff? And what was valuable about the group interactions, different people teaching me and communicating with me, and the arguments we've had about what was important and what wasn't important, and those debates are all part of this process. And so as you listen to the other workshop briefings today, be thinking about these briefings also as a way to educate yourself and inform yourself about issues you have not been as deeply involved in, because this is really the kind of process that you'll be doing, hopefully, for your entire career. So we're going to begin with Professor Apson's group, who will give us a briefing on the New York, New Jersey Watershed Protection Act. So the briefers here.
Hello, my name is Kate Zabinsky, and today I will be presenting on S3484, the New York, New Jersey Watershed Protection Act. I want to start off by thanking my team for all the hard work they put in this summer, and especially to my deputy, Lauren Farmer, and our faculty advisor, Professor Apson. So today we're going to go through an overview of the bill, its main priorities, what some success indicators are, as well as some case studies, and finally some key takeaways. So the bill was introduced in January by Senator Cory Booker. It's currently in committee. As a quick reminder, a watershed is not just a body or bodies of water, but it's the land that drains into them. In fact, you're currently sitting on the watershed that our bill deals with, as the land that Columbia is on drains into the Hudson, which is part of the watershed, along with the New York, New Jersey Harbor, the Mohawk River, the Bronx River, the Raritan Passaic, and the Hackensack in New Jersey. So the bill provides $50 million a year in funding. It will be administered by the Department of the Interior, that will be able to coordinate across state lines with agencies such as the EPA, NOAA, the National Park Service, with governors of New York and New Jersey, Native American tribes, and other organizations and agencies. So this watershed is not only the most populous watershed in the United States, but it's of great financial importance. It takes in more than $60 billion a year from tourism, commercial fishing, and recreation alone. So the bill has four main priorities: water quality improvement, flood management and climate change resilience, wildlife habitat restoration and protection, and environmental justice, which the bill defines as community access, education, and public health. So in a minute, I'm going to walk you through some case studies that are examples of what this bill would help fund and coordinate. But before that, I want to talk about how these projects will be evaluated. So each situation needs a common model that should be used to evaluate the problem, the solution, and potential success. So we start by gathering the resources that are needed for the potential solution, followed by using them to create and plan and implement the solution. And the output is the result of the process, and this is where accurate and measurable data is key. And the outcome is, hopefully, restoration of the watershed. So for our first case study, we go just to the west in the lower Passaic River. So one detriment to water quality is legacy pollutants. These are pollutants that come from industrial installations that, while they're no longer actively discharging pollution into the water, are still causing problems to these days. So these pollutants can cause major health problems such as gastrointestinal and respiratory disease. One way to remove them is to dredge the riverbed, which can hopefully remove things, for example, such as PCBs and heavy metals. There are risks to dredging, such as reduced dissolved oxygen levels and habitat destruction. So in this photo, you actually see the active project that's going on right now, and it's near a factory that in the 1960s produced Agent Orange. Like I said, the legacy pollutants hang around for a long time. So the next case study, we're going to go up into the Catskills and talk about flood management. So one issue these days with increased precipitation combined with developed and impermeable surfaces is combined sewer overflows, or CSOs, and this is when sewers reach capacity and the sewage, untreated sewage, ends up going directly into nearby water bodies. So green infrastructure such as riparian buffers, one of which you can see here from Tannersville, can be used to mitigate such of these issues. There are possible risks with green infrastructure, including groundwater contamination from permeable pavement, while the water might not be discharged into the body of water, water with things such as motor oil or other pollutants can seep into the groundwater. Permeable pavements also have relatively low speed limits, about 30 miles an hour, so there's limited use. And there's also, from an environmental justice perspective, an issue of green gentrification, in where adding this greenery can sometimes increase property values and desirability of the area and push current residents out. So Tannersville, New York was devastated by Tropical Storm Irene. This storm damage is not just an issue for the coast. They had water damage in homes, they had sinkholes on Main Street, and they had huge amounts of sewage overflow. So they decided to implement some of these green infrastructure techniques. The project is very recent, but scientific evaluations suggest that the reduction of runoff will help lower phosphates by 72% and nitrates flowing into the water by 55%. So next we're going to go a little further south to Wappingers Creek. So dams can disrupt the natural flow of water and block migration of species such as this American eel. While removing a dam can restore these flows, there's also risks, such as no return to pre-dam conditions and short-term sedimentation from the increased flow of water upon removal. So despite this, the dam was removed in 2016. From a animal habitat restoration point of view, this was a success. American eel numbers grew from 50,000 1 year before the dam removal in 2015 to 400,000 eels in 2020. That's an 800% increase. So lastly, we're going to come back to our neighborhood in the New York, New Jersey harbor. So in the harbor, as well as the Raritan in New Jersey, there are efforts to seed oyster reefs, and these oyster reefs are a great example of all four of the priorities coming together. So in terms of water quality, one oyster can filter 50 gallons of water a day. They can help reduce flooding and slow erosion by breaking up wave energy as it comes in. The reef seeding restores habitats not only of the oysters, which used to be quite abundant in these waters, but also of the organisms that live amongst the oysters. And as far as environmental justice, which I said is defined in this bill partly as education and community engagement, more than 8,000 public school children have been involved in this project. So finally, some key takeaways. The first is that all problems must be evaluated scientifically, and all the solutions must consider both scientific evidence and social equity. It's a federal bill that funds and coordinates between multiple case studies, and in doing so, it will help complement some of the projects that I talked you through, as well as expand on them and fund new ones. And all of this is essential for implementation, which we will be exploring more this fall. Thank you, and any questions?
Thank you so much for the presentation. That was amazing. It seems like a lot of the solutions you talked about are for more urban areas. Is there anything being done in the more rural areas of the watershed?
So the riparian buffers that I talked about can be used in rural areas. They're used a lot to as a barrier between agricultural land. Agricultural runoff is an issue, and rivers. And there's also something called cover crops, which can be planted between growing seasons that can help absorb some of the water and runoff and keep the soil healthy.
Awesome, thank you.
Sorry, you talked a little bit about oyster restoration and you mentioned reef seeding, and I was just curious if you could talk a little bit more about like what that process entails.
So there's a project in New York City, it's called the Billion Oyster Project. And what they do actually is collect oyster shells from a bunch of restaurants and other sources, and they put them into these big cages and then drop them into non-navigable, so they can't put them in certain areas, but they will put them, and the oysters will then grow, because oysters need an empty shell in order to go into them and live there. And the idea is they're not going to drop 1 billion oysters in, but the hope is that they will breed themselves and eventually reach high numbers.